In the ancient kingdom of Valdoria, where tradition runs deeper than the mountain springs, and palace walls hold secrets older than the crown itself, a single conversation between two women would shake the very foundations of the monarchy. What happens when a queen consort's desperate attempt to secure her legacy collides with a beloved princess's unwavering principles? And what occurs when a future king must choose between the woman who raised his father and the woman who captured his heart? In the marble corridors where whispers travel faster than royal decrees, Lady Serafina's bold gambit against Princess Isabella would trigger a chain of events that no one, not even the wisest court advisors, could have predicted. For in Valdoria, power isn't just inherited. It's earned, fought for, and sometimes lost in the span of a single moment when pride meets principle and love collides with duty. This is the story of how one woman's fear of being forgotten ignited a palace revolution that would either destroy the royal family or forge it stronger than ever before. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ancient stones of Castle Valdoria as Lady Serafina Blackwood stood before the towering windows of her private chambers. At 52, she remained a striking woman, her silver hair meticulously styled and her emerald gown chosen with the precision of someone who understood that every detail mattered in the delicate game of royal politics. Today, more than any other day, she needed to project strength, authority, and unwavering determination. Serafina had not been born to royalty. 25 years ago, she had been simply Lady Blackwood, a widow from one of Valdoria's oldest noble houses. Her marriage to King Edmund following the tragic death of his first wife had shocked the kingdom and divided the court. Critics whispered that she was ambitious, calculating, a woman who had seized opportunity from tragedy. Supporters praised her grace under pressure and her dedication to the crown. But Serafina had learned long ago that in the palace, perception often mattered more than truth. The king's first wife, Queen Lina, had been beloved by the people, beautiful, kind, and tragically taken by illness when Prince Alexander was only 12 years old. She had become something of a martyr in the public consciousness. Serafina had spent the last quarter-century living in that shadow, working tirelessly to prove herself worthy of the crown that had once graced Lina's head. She had been a devoted stepmother to Alexander, a faithful companion to Edmund, and a dedicated servant to the kingdom. Yet despite all her efforts, she often felt like she was still fighting for acceptance, still proving that she belonged. Now, King Edmund lay gravely ill. The physician spoke in hushed tones about months, perhaps weeks. The reality that had loomed on the horizon for the past year was rapidly approaching. Alexander would soon be king, and his wife, Princess Isabella of Astoria, would be queen. And Serafina would become the Dowager Queen, expected to step gracefully aside and allow the new generation to take the throne. It was a transition she had always known would come, but the actual prospect filled her with a cold dread that she struggled to suppress. Not because she craved power for its own sake, but because she feared being forgotten, being relegated to a footnote in Valdoria's history. She had given her best years to this kingdom, had sacrificed her own desires and ambitions for the crown, and the thought of disappearing into obscurity was unbearable. The door to her chambers opened with a soft click, and her personal secretary, Marcus Reed, entered with a bow. Marcus had served her faithfully for 15 years, a thin man with intelligent eyes who understood the complexities of court life better than most nobles. He was one of the few people in the palace who truly understood Serafina's struggles and ambitions. "Your Majesty," Marcus said, his voice carefully neutral. "Princess Isabella has requested an audience with you this afternoon. She wishes to discuss the upcoming transition ceremonies." Serafina turned from the window, her expression composed, but her mind racing. Isabella's request was not unexpected, but the timing felt significant. The young woman had been increasingly involved in royal duties as Edmund's health declined, and her confidence seemed to grow with each passing day. At 28, Isabella possessed a natural charisma that reminded Serafina painfully of Queen Lionel. She was intelligent, compassionate, and genuinely beloved by the people in a way that Serafina had never quite managed to achieve despite decades of service. "Of course," Serafina replied smoothly. "Schedule the meeting for 3 o'clock in my sitting room. And, Marcus, please ensure we are not interrupted." As Marcus bowed and departed, Serafina returned to the window, watching as gardeners tended to the rose garden below. Those roses had been planted by Queen Lionel decades ago, and Isabella had taken a particular interest in maintaining them since her marriage to Alexander 3 years ago. It was a small thing, perhaps, but to Serafina, it felt symbolic of how easily Isabella had stepped into the role that Serafina had worked so hard to fill. The hours until the meeting passed slowly. Serafina reviewed documents, met with household staff, and attended to correspondence, but her mind remained focused on the conversation ahead. She had been considering this moment for weeks, weighing her options and planning her approach. Today, she had decided she would take control of the narrative surrounding the transition. She would ensure that her legacy was secure and that her influence would continue beyond Edmund's passing. At precisely 3 o'clock, Isabella arrived at Serafina's chambers. The princess was dressed in a simple but elegant blue dress, her dark hair arranged in a modest style that somehow managed to look both regal and approachable. She moved with a grace that seemed effortless, and when she smiled, it was with genuine warmth. Despite her reservations about Isabella's rapid rise to prominence, Serafina had to admit that the young woman was perfectly suited for queenship. "Lady Serafina," Isabella said, offering a respectful curtsy. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." "Please sit," Serafina replied, gesturing to an elegant chair across from her own. She had arranged the seating carefully, ensuring that while they were on equal level, the positioning subtly reinforced her current status as queen consort. "I understand you wish to discuss the transition ceremonies." Isabella settled gracefully into her chair, her posture conveying both confidence and respect. "Yes, I wanted to speak with you about how we might best honor both the continuity of the crown and the new direction that Alexander and I hope to bring to the kingdom. Your experience and wisdom would be invaluable in shaping these ceremonies." It was a diplomatic opening, and Serafina appreciated Isabella's skill even as she recognized the underlying message. The younger woman was acknowledging Serafina's past contributions while making it clear that change was coming. It was exactly the kind of subtle maneuvering that Serafina herself might have employed at Isabella's age. "I appreciate your consideration," Serafina responded, her tone carefully measured. "However, I believe there are more fundamental issues we should address before we concern ourselves with ceremonial details." Isabella's expression remained pleasant, but Serafina caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested increased attention. "What kind of issues?" This was the moment Serafina had been preparing for. She leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "Isabella, you are about to become queen of one of the most complex kingdoms in Europe. Valdoria's position requires delicate balancing of numerous interests. Our noble houses, our merchant classes, our international alliances, our military obligations. It is not a role that can be learned from books or good intentions alone. I understand the weight of responsibility," Isabella replied, her voice steady. "Alexander and I have been preparing for this transition for years. We've studied Valdoria's history, its current challenges, and its opportunities for growth. Study is valuable," Serafina acknowledged, "but it cannot replace experience. I've spent 25 years navigating these waters, building relationships, understanding the subtle currents that drive palace politics. That institutional knowledge, that network of trust and understanding represents a resource that would be foolish to discard." Isabella was quiet for a moment, clearly considering her words carefully. When she spoke, her tone remained respectful but firm. "No one is suggesting that your experience should be discarded, Lady Serafina. Your contributions to Valdoria are deeply appreciated and will always be honored. However, every transition brings change, and I believe that some changes are necessary for the kingdom's continued prosperity. The polite rejection was delivered with skill, but it was still a rejection. Serafina felt a familiar flash of frustration, the same feeling she had experienced countless times over the years when her counsel was dismissed or her authority subtly undermined. But this time, she had prepared for this moment. This time, she would not simply accept being pushed aside. Change, yes, Serafina said, her voice taking on a sharper edge. But change guided by wisdom and experience, not youthful enthusiasm and idealism. Isabella, there are aspects of ruling this kingdom that you simply do not yet understand. There are relationships and obligations that go back generations, treaties and agreements that require careful handling, noble houses whose loyalty must be carefully maintained. One misstep could destabilize everything we have built. Isabella's composure remained intact, but Serafina could see that her words had struck home. The younger woman was intelligent enough to recognize the truth in what Serafina was saying, even if she disagreed with the implications. "I appreciate your concern," Isabella said carefully, "and I hope that we can continue to benefit from your counsel as we navigate these challenges. However, I believe that fresh perspectives can also bring valuable insights. Alexander and I are committed to ruling with both respect for tradition and openness to necessary reforms." "Reforms," Serafina repeated, her tone making the word sound almost distasteful. "What kind of reforms are you considering?" This was dangerous ground, and both women knew it. Isabella hesitated for just a moment before responding, clearly weighing how much to reveal. "We believe that the monarchy must evolve to remain relevant in the modern world. That means greater transparency in our operations, more direct engagement with the people, and a willingness to address some of the inequalities that have persisted for too long." Serafina felt her heart rate increase. These were exactly the kinds of changes she had feared Isabella might pursue. Well-intentioned perhaps, but potentially catastrophic for the delicate balance of power that kept Valdoria stable. More troubling still was the casual way Isabella spoke of these radical shifts, as if they were simple matters of policy rather than fundamental alterations to the kingdom's very nature. "Isabella," Serafina said, her voice now carrying unmistakable authority, "you speak of transparency and reform as if they are unqualified goods. But transparency can be dangerous when it exposes necessary compromises. Reform can be destructive when it destabilizes systems that have evolved over centuries. The crown's power rests not just on law and tradition, but on mystique and perceived authority. Too much openness, too much change, can erode that authority irreparably." "With respect, Lady Serafina," Isabella replied, her own voice gaining strength, "I believe that authority based solely on mystique and tradition is inherently fragile. True authority comes from the consent and trust of the people. If our rule cannot withstand transparency, then perhaps it deserves to be questioned." The words hung in the air between them like a thrown gauntlet. Serafina recognized in that moment that this was not merely a disagreement about policy. This was a fundamental clash of worldviews. Isabella represented everything that Serafina had spent her reign trying to prevent. The erosion of traditional authority, the dangerous democratization of royal power, the naive belief that good intentions could substitute for hard-won wisdom. "I see," Serafina said finally, her voice deceptively calm. "Then I suppose there is little point in continuing this discussion. You have made your position quite clear." Isabella seemed to recognize that something significant had shifted in their conversation. "Lady Serafina, I hope that despite our different perspectives, we can work together for Valdoria's benefit. Your experience truly is valuable, and I would welcome your guidance as we—" "My guidance," Serafina interrupted, rising from her chair with fluid grace, "has just been made clear to be unwelcome. You prefer fresh perspectives to experienced ones, reform to stability, idealism to pragmatism. That is your choice to make. But Choices have consequences, Isabella. I hope you are prepared for them. Isabella also rose, her composure intact, but her eyes now reflecting understanding of the deeper currents at play. I hope that in time, you will see that change and wisdom need not be mutually exclusive. Valdoria is strong enough to adapt and grow while honoring its traditions. Perhaps, Serafina replied with a smile that did not reach her eyes. Time will tell. As Isabella departed with formal courtesies exchanged, Serafina remained standing by the window, her mind already turning to the next phase of her plan. The conversation had gone exactly as she had expected it would. Isabella was intelligent, principled, and completely unprepared for the realities of what ruling actually required. She would learn eventually, but by then it might be too late to prevent significant damage to the kingdom. But Serafina would not simply stand aside and watch decades of careful statecraft be undone by youthful idealism. She had spent too many years building networks, cultivating relationships, and establishing systems of influence to allow them to be dismantled. If Isabella and Alexander would not accept her guidance willingly, then she would find other ways to ensure that Valdoria's stability was preserved. That evening, as twilight fell across the castle grounds, Serafina sat in her private study, composing carefully worded letters to several key figures in the kingdom. Duke Rothschild, whose lands bordered the troubled northern provinces. Lord Thornfield, whose merchant interests connected him to nobles across the continent. Lady Ashford, whose salons were famous for their political discussions. Each letter was personalized, touching on specific concerns and shared interests, but all carried the same underlying message. The upcoming transition would require careful management, and experienced hands would be needed to guide the kingdom through potentially turbulent times. She was not planning a rebellion or a coup. Such dramatic gestures were rarely necessary and almost always counterproductive. Instead, she was laying the groundwork for a different kind of influence, the kind that operated through whispered conversations and careful suggestions through strategic alliances and mutual obligations. Isabella might become queen, but Serafina would ensure that the true power remained in more experienced hands. As she sealed the last letter, Serafina allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. The game was far from over, and she still had moves to make. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to shape the kingdom's future, and she intended to seize every one of them. Isabella might have youth and idealism on her side, but Serafina had something far more valuable, the patience and cunning that came from decades of navigating palace intrigue. The young princess would soon learn that becoming queen was far easier than actually ruling. And when that lesson came, Serafina would be ready to provide the guidance that had been so politely rejected today, on her own terms and with her own conditions. The storm was just beginning to gather, and Serafina intended to be the one who decided where the lightning would strike. 3 weeks had passed since Serafina's fateful conversation with Isabella, and the effects of her carefully orchestrated campaign were beginning to show. The letters she had sent had borne fruit in the form of discreet conversations, strategic lunches, and private meetings that were reshaping the landscape of palace politics. What had started as whispered concerns about the upcoming transition were growing into genuine apprehension about the direction the kingdom might take under Alexander and Isabella's rule. Duke Rothschild had been particularly receptive to Serafina's subtle suggestions. His vast estates in the northern provinces had long been troubled by border skirmishes with neighboring kingdoms, and he relied heavily on traditional military agreements that had been negotiated over decades. The prospect of Isabella's promised reforms, particularly those involving military spending and international relations, had made him deeply uncomfortable. During their private dinner 3 days earlier, he had confided his fears that inexperienced leadership might destabilize the delicate peace his region depended upon. Lady Serafina, he had said over brandy and carefully chosen words, your wisdom has guided this kingdom through some of our most challenging periods. It would be tragic if that experience were not given the weight it deserves in the coming transition. Similar sentiments had emerged from her other correspondence. Lord Thornfield was concerned about proposed changes to trade policies that might affect his merchant networks. Lady Ashford worried about court ceremonial reforms that could alienate traditional allies. Each concern was legitimate in its own right, but together they formed a pattern of resistance that Serafina was carefully nurturing. However, the most significant development had come from an unexpected source: Prince Alexander himself. The heir to the throne had grown increasingly distant from Isabella over the past week, spending long hours in his father's study and engaging in private conversations with advisors who had been notably absent from his circle in recent months. Serafina had observed these changes with satisfaction, but also with growing curiosity about what was driving them. Her answer came on a gray Thursday morning when Alexander requested a private audience with her. The prince arrived at her chambers looking tired and troubled, his usual confident bearing replaced by something approaching uncertainty. At 31, Alexander was a handsome man who resembled his late mother in his fine features and his father in his steady bearing. He had always been dutiful, intelligent, and principled, qualities that made him an excellent heir, but sometimes left him vulnerable to doubt during times of pressure. "Stepmother," he said, using the title he had called her since childhood, despite the fact that he was now a grown man, "I hope I'm not intruding. I want to speak with you about something that's been troubling me." Serafina gestured for him to sit in the same chair Isabella had occupied 3 weeks earlier. The irony was not lost on her, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. "Of course, Alexander. You know you're always welcome here. What's troubling you?" Alexander ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture he had inherited from his father. "It's about Isabella and some of the ideas she's been discussing for when we take the throne. I'm beginning to have concerns about whether we're moving too quickly, changing too much at once." This was exactly what Serafina had been hoping to hear, though she was careful not to show her satisfaction. Instead, she adopted an expression of maternal concern. "What kind of concerns?" "She speaks of transparency and reform as if they're simple matters of policy," Alexander said, echoing almost exactly the words Serafina had used in her letters to the nobles. "But I've been thinking about what Father has always told me about the delicate balance required to rule effectively. I worry that too much change, too quickly, could destabilize institutions that have served us well for generations." Serafina leaned forward slightly, her voice filled with the warmth of a mother concerned for her child. "Alexander, your father has indeed spoken wisely about these matters. Ruling a kingdom is not like running a business or leading a charity. The forces at play are complex and often invisible. Good intentions, while admirable, can sometimes lead to unintended consequences." "That's exactly what I've been thinking," Alexander replied, relief evident in his voice. "Isabella means well, I know that. She's intelligent and caring, and she genuinely wants what's best for Valdoria. But sometimes I wonder if her perspective, coming from Astoria, might not fully account for our unique challenges and traditions." This was a particularly shrewd observation on Alexander's part, and Serafina recognized an opportunity to deepen his doubts. Astoria was a smaller, more modern kingdom that had undergone significant democratization in recent decades. While successful in its own context, its political model was quite different from Valdoria's more traditional approach. "Isabella's background certainly shapes her perspective," Serafina said carefully, "and there's value in outside viewpoints. However, each kingdom must find its own path based on its own history, culture, and circumstances. What works in Astoria may not be appropriate for Valdoria, despite the best of intentions." Alexander nodded thoughtfully. "I've been wondering if perhaps we should move more gradually with any changes. Take time to consult with experienced advisors, really understand the implications before implementing reforms." "That sounds like the wisdom of someone who truly understands the weight of responsibility," Serafina replied. "Your father would be proud to hear you speak with such thoughtfulness about these matters." As their conversation continued, Serafina skillfully guided Alexander toward increasingly serious doubts about Isabella's judgment. She never directly criticized the princess, but instead praised Alexander's growing wisdom and mature perspective. She shared carefully chosen examples from her own experience of how well-intentioned changes had sometimes produced unexpected problems. She spoke of the importance of consulting with nobles who had generations of experience managing their regions and understanding their people's needs. By the time Alexander left her chambers an hour later, he was visibly troubled, but also clearly grateful for what he perceived as his stepmother's wise counsel. Serafina watched him go with a sense of accomplishment tempered by genuine concern. She did care for Alexander. He had been a good stepson, and she wanted him to succeed as king. But she also believed firmly that his success would require her continued influence and Isabella's reduced role in shaping policy. That afternoon brought an unexpected development when Marcus informed her that Isabella had requested another meeting. This time, however, the princess's manner was noticeably different when she arrived. Gone was the diplomatic courtesy of their previous encounter. Instead, Isabella's bearing suggested someone who had recognized the challenge and was prepared to meet it directly. "Lady Serafina," Isabella said without preliminary pleasantries, "I think we need to have a more direct conversation than we did several weeks ago." Serafina raised an eyebrow, but maintained her composure. "Oh, what about? About the campaign you've been conducting to undermine confidence in the changes, Alexander, and I have been planning," Isabella replied with a directness that caught Serafina off guard. For a moment, the older woman considered denying the accusation, but something in Isabella's manner suggested that evasion would be both pointless and potentially counterproductive. Instead, she chose a different approach. "I prefer to think of it as providing experienced counsel to those who might benefit from it," Serafina said smoothly. "Surely you don't object to the nobles of our kingdom having access to different perspectives as they consider the future?" "Different perspectives, no," Isabella replied. "But systematic undermining of confidence, yes. Lady Serafina, I know that Duke Rothschild, Lord Thornfield, and Lady Ashford have all had private conversations with you in recent weeks. I also know that Alexander has become increasingly hesitant about reforms that he was previously enthusiastic about. That's not coincidence." Serafina was impressed despite herself. Isabella was clearly more politically astute than she had given her credit for. "And if I've been sharing my concerns with people who ask for my opinion, what exactly is the problem? Am I not entitled to express my views?" "Of course you are," Isabella said. "But let's be honest about what's happening here. You're not just expressing views. You're working to maintain your influence by convincing people that change is dangerous and that experience should trump everything else, including the democratic will of our people." The conversation was moving into territory that Serafina had not expected. Isabella's use of phrases like democratic will suggested she was more committed to fundamental changes than Serafina had realized. This was not merely about policy preferences. This was about competing visions of what monarchy should be in the modern world. "Isabella," Serafina said, her voice taking on a harder edge, "I have spent 25 years serving this kingdom. I have navigated crises, managed relationships, and maintained stability through some very difficult periods. That experience has value, whether you choose to acknowledge it or not. And if the nobles of this realm prefer to listen to someone with that experience rather than someone with idealistic theories about democratic will and transparency, perhaps that should tell you something about the wisdom of your approach." "What it tells me," Isabella replied, her own voice strengthening, "is that entrenched interests resist change, even when that change is necessary for the long-term health of our kingdom. Lady Serafina, I respect your service and your experience, but I will not allow fear of change to prevent us from addressing real problems that affect real people. And I will not allow naive idealism to destroy institutions that have served this kingdom for centuries," Serafina shot back. "You speak of the democratic will of the people as if you have some mandate to transform Valdoria into a different kind of state entirely. But this is a monarchy, Isabella. It has always been a monarchy. The people expect stability, continuity, and competent leadership, not revolutionary changes based on foreign models. Isabella stood up, her posture now radiating controlled anger. Foreign models? Lady Serafina, the idea that rulers should serve their people rather than the other way around is not foreign. It's basic justice. And if you think that maintaining your personal influence is more important than addressing the needs of our citizens, then perhaps you're not as concerned with Valdoria's welfare as you claim to be. The accusation hung in the air between them like a sword. Serafina felt a flash of genuine anger at the suggestion that her motives were purely personal. She had sacrificed for this kingdom, had endured years of criticism and suspicion, had worked tirelessly to prove herself worthy of the crown. The idea that she would put personal interest ahead of Valdoria's welfare was deeply offensive. "How dare you?" Serafina said, her voice low and dangerous. "You have been in this palace for 3 years, Isabella. 3 years. I have been here for 25. I have bled for this kingdom, given my life to it, earned every ounce of influence I possess through service and sacrifice. And now you presume to lecture me about serving the people? You, who have never had to make the hard choices, never had to balance competing interests, never had to sacrifice personal desires for duty." Isabella's composure cracked slightly at the fury in Serafina's voice, but she held her ground. "I'm not questioning your service or your sacrifices. I'm questioning whether your approach is what Valdoria needs now." Sometimes, Lady Serafina, holding on to power too tightly can be just as harmful as letting go of it too quickly. The two women stared at each other across the elegant sitting room, the space between them charged with years of accumulated tension and fundamentally different worldviews. Finally, Serafina spoke, her voice now coldly controlled. "Very well, Isabella. You have made your position clear, and I have made mine. You believe that your vision for Valdoria's future should prevail over the concerns of those who have actually governed it. You are entitled to that belief. But you should understand that beliefs, however sincerely held, do not automatically translate into successful policy. Experience matters. Relationships matter. Understanding the complex currents that drive this kingdom matters. You may choose to ignore those realities, but they will not ignore you." "Are you threatening me, Lady Serafina?" "I am informing you," Serafina replied with icy precision. "The nobles you dismiss as entrenched interests control vast estates, command military units, and manage the economic relationships that keep this kingdom functioning. The advisors whose experience you discount have navigated crises that could have destroyed us. The traditions you want to reform have evolved over centuries to balance forces you don't yet understand. You can declare your intention to change all of that, but changing it and successfully managing the consequences are two very different things." Isabella moved toward the door, then paused and turned back. "Lady Serafina, I came here today hoping we could find common ground. I still believe that's possible, but only if you're willing to accept that the future cannot be a simple continuation of the past. Valdoria needs to evolve, and that evolution requires new approaches as well as traditional wisdom." "Evolution? Yes," Serafina agreed. "Revolution? No. The question is whether you understand the difference." After Isabella left, Serafina stood for a long time staring out at the rose garden, her mind turning over the implications of their conversation. The battle lines were now clearly drawn, and there would be no more diplomatic pretense. Isabella had proven herself to be more formidable than expected, but she had also revealed the extent of her radical intentions. The reference to democratic will and serving the people suggested changes that went far beyond policy adjustments. She was talking about fundamental alterations to the nature of monarchy itself. That evening, Serafina composed additional letters, these more urgent in tone than her previous correspondence. The time for subtle influence was passing. The situation now required more direct action. She wrote to military commanders who had served faithfully for decades, to provincial governors who understood the importance of stability, to foreign ambassadors who valued predictability in their diplomatic relationships. The web she had been weaving was tightening, and soon Isabella would discover that good intentions and moral certainty were not sufficient tools for managing a complex kingdom. The real test would come when Alexander was forced to choose between his wife's idealistic vision and the practical realities of governing. Serafina intended to ensure that when that moment arrived, he would have all the information he needed to make the right choice. But as she sealed the last letter, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered a troubling question. What if Isabella was right? What if the kingdom did need fundamental change? What if her own attachment to traditional methods was blinding her to necessary evolution? She pushed the thought aside almost immediately, but it lingered like an uncomfortable itch. After all, she had been questioning authority and tradition when she married Edmund, challenging expectations and changing the course of her own life. Was it possible that she had become the very thing she had once opposed? The thought was too dangerous to entertain, too threatening to the certainty that had sustained her through years of struggle and sacrifice. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to shape the kingdom's future, and new tests of her ability to protect the institutions she had spent her life serving. There was no time for self-doubt, no room for uncertainty. The storm was gathering strength, and Serafina intended to emerge from it with her influence intact and her legacy secure. Prince Alexander stood in his father's private study, surrounded by centuries of royal history. Portraits of Valdorian kings gazed down from the walls, their painted eyes seeming to weigh his worthiness to join their number. The heavy oak desk, scarred by decades of use, held the weight of countless momentous decisions. Tonight, it would bear one more. King Edmund lay dying in the royal chambers above, his breath growing shallower with each passing hour. The physicians had given their final verdict that morning. Days, perhaps hours remained. Soon, very soon, Alexander would wear the crown that had passed from father to son for over 4 centuries. The weight of that impending responsibility pressed down on him like a physical force. But the crown was not his only burden. On the desk before him lay 2 documents that represented 2 entirely different visions for Valdoria's future. The first, prepared by Isabella with input from progressive advisors, outlined sweeping reforms, constitutional limits on royal power, expanded rights for common citizens, transparency requirements for government operations, and democratic representation in key policy decisions. The second, compiled by Serafina and traditional court advisors, proposed gradual, carefully managed changes that would preserve existing institutions while addressing the most pressing social concerns. Alexander had spent hours studying both proposals, and with each reading, his confusion had deepened rather than clarified. Isabella's reforms were bold, comprehensive, and morally compelling. They addressed real inequalities and would likely improve the lives of many Valdorian citizens. But they also represented a fundamental transformation of the monarchy, perhaps even its eventual dissolution. Serafina's approach was more cautious, preserving stability and continuity, but potentially failing to address systemic problems that had festered for generations. The sound of footsteps in the corridor interrupted his thoughts. Isabella entered the study, her face drawn with exhaustion and worry. She had spent the day at her father-in-law's bedside, reading to him from his favorite books and holding his hand as consciousness drifted in and out. Despite their political differences, she had grown genuinely fond of King Edmund, and his approaching death weighed heavily on her heart. "How is he?" Alexander asked, though the answer was written in her expression. "Peaceful," Isabella replied softly. "He asked about you. He wants to see you before." She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Alexander nodded and moved toward the door, but Isabella's voice stopped him. "Alexander, before you go up, we need to talk about what happens next. The transition ceremonies, the immediate policy decisions, the messages we send to both our people and the international community. There are preparations that can't wait. He turned to face her, seeing not just his wife, but the woman who would soon be queen. In the lamplight, she looked both beautiful and formidable, her dark eyes reflecting intelligence and determination that had first attracted him when they met at a diplomatic conference 5 years earlier. She had been representing Astoria's interests with skill beyond her years, and he had been impressed by her combination of principled conviction and pragmatic negotiating ability. "Isabella," he said carefully, "I've been reviewing the reform proposals you've prepared, and I have to say I'm concerned about the scope and pace of change you're suggesting." Her expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "What kind of concerns?" Alexander moved back to the desk, gesturing toward the documents spread across its surface. These reforms would fundamentally alter the nature of Valdorian government. Constitutional monarchy, elected advisory councils, public oversight of royal finances. These aren't incremental changes, Isabella. These are revolutionary transformations. "Yes, they are," she replied, her voice gaining strength. "Because incremental changes have failed to address the fundamental inequities in our system. Alexander, we have noble houses that control vast resources while common families struggle to feed their children. We have military expenditures that benefit weapons manufacturers while schools lack basic supplies. We have trade policies that enrich merchant elites while farmers can barely make ends meet. These aren't problems that can be solved with small adjustments. They require systemic change." Alexander felt the familiar tug of conviction in her words. Isabella's passion for justice was one of the qualities he loved most about her. But love and admiration didn't automatically translate into political wisdom. "I understand the problems exist," he said, "but the solutions you're proposing could destabilize the very foundations of our kingdom. Constitutional limits on royal power might sound progressive, but they could also paralyze our ability to respond quickly to crises. Democratic representation might seem fair, but it could lead to gridlock and political chaos. Transparency in royal finances might appear noble, but it could expose sensitive information that our enemies might exploit." Isabella stepped closer to the desk, her eyes flashing with frustration. "Alexander, every one of those objections sounds exactly like the argument Serafina has been making to the nobles. Are these really your concerns, or are they hers?" The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to be uncomfortable. Alexander's conversations with Serafina had certainly influenced his thinking, but he genuinely believed his concerns were valid regardless of their source. "Does it matter where the concerns come from if they're legitimate?" "Isabella, Serafina has 25 years of experience governing this kingdom. She's navigated international crises, managed noble tensions, and maintained stability through some very difficult periods. Her perspective has value, even if you disagree with it." "Her perspective has value," Isabella agreed. "But so does the perspective of people who haven't been part of the existing power structure." "Alexander, Serafina's experience is entirely based on maintaining a system that benefits a small elite at the expense of everyone else. She's not opposed to reform because it's dangerous. She's opposed because it threatens her influence and the privileges she's spent decades accumulating." Alexander felt anger flare at what seemed like an attack on someone who had been a mother figure to him. "That's unfair, Isabella. Serafina has dedicated her life to serving this kingdom. She married my father not for personal gain, but from a sense of duty. She's been a loyal stepmother to me and a faithful companion to him. The idea that she's motivated purely by self-interest is both cruel and inaccurate." "I'm not saying she's evil," Isabella replied, her tone softening slightly. "I'm saying she's human. Her perspective is shaped by her experiences, just like everyone else's. But her experiences have been those of someone at the top of a hierarchical system. She's never had to worry about feeding her children or paying for medical care or finding decent housing. She's never had to navigate a legal system that treats nobles and commoners differently. Her version of stability is one that preserves her comfort and position, not one that ensures justice for all our people. The argument was compelling, but it also felt like an attack on everything Alexander had been taught about duty, service, and the responsibilities of leadership. Isabella, the monarchy has survived for centuries because it has provided stability and continuity. Yes, the system has inequities, but destroying it in pursuit of perfect justice could lead to chaos that hurts everyone, especially the people you're trying to help. Look at what happened in neighboring kingdoms that underwent rapid democratization: political instability, economic disruption, social unrest. Is that really what you want for Valdoria? Isabella was quiet for a moment, clearly wrestling with the weight of his words. When she spoke, her voice was calmer but no less determined. Alexander, I understand the risks, but I also understand the risks of doing nothing. Every year we delay meaningful reform is another year that talented people leave our kingdom for places that offer more opportunities. Another year that resentment builds among people who see their leaders living in luxury while they struggle with basic needs. Another year that our international reputation suffers as other nations move toward more democratic governance. They were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Marcus Reed entered with a bow, his expression grave. Your Highnesses, His Majesty has requested your presence. He says it's urgent. Alexander and Isabella exchanged glances, their argument forgotten in the face of immediate duty. They made their way quickly to the royal chambers, where King Edmund lay propped against silk pillows, his breathing labored, but his eyes alert. At 68, he remained an imposing figure despite his illness, his silver hair still thick, and his bearing retaining echoes of the commanding presence that had defined his reign. Alexander, Isabella, he said, his voice weak but clear. Come here, both of you. They approached the bed, and Edmund reached out to take their hands in his own. His grip was surprisingly strong for someone so close to death. I don't have much time left, he said without preamble. There are things I need to tell you before I go. Father, please don't, Alexander began, but Edmund raised a hand to stop him. No platitudes, son. We both know what's happening here. He turned to Isabella. My dear, you've been a blessing to this family and to this kingdom. Alexander chose well when he chose you. Isabella's eyes filled with tears. Thank you, Your Majesty. It's been an honor to serve. Edmund nodded, then looked back at Alexander. Son, I know you're struggling with questions about how to rule, what changes to make, how to balance competing interests. It's the burden every king faces, and there are no easy answers. Father, I want to do what's right, but I'm not sure what that means anymore. Isabella wants sweeping reforms. Serafina counsels caution, and the nobles are divided. How do I know which path to choose? King Edmund was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving between his son and daughter-in-law. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of decades of experience. Alexander, I've made many decisions during my reign, some good, some less so. But the best decisions were always the ones where I listened to different perspectives, weighed the consequences carefully, and then had the courage to act according to my own best judgment, regardless of who might be displeased. He squeezed Alexander's hand more tightly. Your stepmother is a wise woman who has served this kingdom faithfully, but her wisdom comes from her experiences and her perspective. Isabella is an intelligent woman with fresh insights, but her ideas are shaped by her background and her ideals. The nobles are practical people with legitimate concerns, but they also have vested interests in maintaining certain arrangements. You must listen to all of them, but you must not let any of them make your decisions for you. Alexander felt the weight of responsibility settling more heavily on his shoulders. But how do I know if I'm making the right choice? You don't, Edmund replied with a sad smile. That's the terrible truth about being king, son. You make the best decision you can with the information available. You accept responsibility for the consequences, and you keep trying to do better. But, Alexander, never forget that you're not just choosing policies. You're choosing what kind of kingdom Valdoria will become. Make sure that when you look back on your reign, You can say with honesty that you serve the people's true interests, not just their immediate demands or traditional expectations. Isabella leaned forward slightly. Your Majesty, what do you think Valdoria's true interests are? Edmund looked at her with something approaching affection. That, my dear, is exactly the question a good queen should be asking. And the answer is that Valdoria's true interests lie in being a kingdom where talent can flourish regardless of birth, where justice is available to all regardless of station, where prosperity is shared broadly rather than hoarded by a few, and where change happens thoughtfully rather than chaotically or not at all. He paused to catch his breath before continuing. I've tried to move us in that direction during my reign, but I was perhaps too cautious, too concerned with maintaining stability at the expense of necessary progress. You two have a chance to do better, but only if you can find a way to combine Isabella's vision with Alexander's prudence, and only if you don't let other people's fears or ambitions override your own judgment. As if summoned by the conversation, Serafina appeared in the doorway. She had clearly been waiting nearby, and her expression showed both grief at Edmund's condition and awareness that something significant was happening. Serafina, Edmund said, gesturing for her to approach. Come here, my dear. She moved to the bedside, and Edmund took her hand as well, so that all four of them were connected in a circle around his bed. Serafina, you have been a devoted wife and a wise counselor. This kingdom owes you a great debt for your service and your sacrifices. Edmund, please, she began, but he continued. But I need you to hear this, all of you. The crown passes to Alexander not because of tradition alone, but because each generation must have the freedom to address the challenges of its own time. Serafina, your experience is invaluable, but it cannot be a substitute for the new leadership's judgment. Isabella, your vision is inspiring, but it must be tempered with understanding of what is practically achievable. Alexander, you must lead, not simply arbitrate between competing voices. The room fell silent except for the sound of Edmund's labored breathing. Outside, storm clouds were gathering, and the first drops of rain began to patter against the windows. Finally, Edmund spoke again, his voice growing weaker. I want you all to promise me something. Promise that whatever disagreements you have, whatever different visions you pursue, you will remember that you all love this kingdom and you all want what's best for its people. Don't let pride or fear or ambition make you forget that common purpose. One by one, they gave their promises, though each wondered privately whether such a promise could be kept in the face of the fundamental differences that divided them. As thunder rumbled in the distance, King Edmund smiled one last time and closed his eyes. He died peacefully 3 hours later, as dawn broke over a kingdom that was about to discover whether centuries of tradition could coexist with the demands of a changing world. Alexander was now king, but the hardest decisions still lay ahead. The coronation of King Alexander III took place on a crisp autumn morning exactly 1 month after his father's death. Cathedral bells rang across the capital as thousands of citizens lined the streets to witness the ancient ceremony that would officially transfer the crown to a new generation. In the great cathedral where Valdorian kings had been crowned for 6 centuries, Archbishop Moreland placed the golden crown upon Alexander's head while the assembled nobility, foreign dignitaries, and common citizens watched in solemn silence. Queen Isabella, radiant in a gown of deep blue silk, received her own crown moments later. As the cathedral erupted in celebration and the traditional cry of "Long live the King, long live the Queen," echoed off the ancient stones, few in attendance could have guessed that the real drama was yet to begin. For while the ceremony marked the official transfer of power, the battle for Alexander's soul and Valdoria's future was far from over. In the weeks following Edmund's death, Serafina had intensified her campaign to influence the new king's decision-making. She had arranged for him to meet with conservative nobles who painted dire pictures of what would happen if radical reforms were implemented too quickly. She had shared carefully selected historical examples of kingdoms that had fallen into chaos after abandoning traditional governance structures. Most effectively, She had positioned herself as the guardian of his father's true legacy, arguing that Edmund's dying words about combining vision with prudence were actually a warning against Isabella's more ambitious proposals. Meanwhile, Isabella had not been idle. She had begun building her own network of support, reaching out to younger nobles who were more open to change, connecting with merchants and professionals who felt excluded from traditional power structures, and even establishing informal communication channels with common citizens who rarely had direct access to royal decision-making. Her approach was less subtle than Serafina's, but potentially more powerful, as it drew strength from a broader base of support rather than relying solely on established elite relationships. The tension between these competing approaches came to a head 3 weeks after the coronation, when Alexander announced his intention to hold a comprehensive review of all pending policy proposals before making any major changes. Both Isabella and Serafina saw this delay as either an opportunity to strengthen their position or a threat to their influence, depending on how the review process was structured and who would have input into the final decisions. Alexander himself was struggling under the weight of his new responsibilities. The crown that had seemed so distant during his father's long illness now felt crushingly heavy on his head. Every decision carried enormous implications. Every conversation seemed freighted with hidden agendas, and every day brought new pressures from different factions within the kingdom. He found himself missing the simpler clarity of his role as heir, when he could focus on learning and preparation rather than actual governance. The crisis that would force his hand came from an unexpected source: the northern provinces, where Duke Rothschild's estates bordered the kingdom of Bretonnia. A trade dispute over mining rights had escalated into something approaching military confrontation, with Bretonnian forces massing near the border and Valdoria merchants demanding protection for their operations. It was exactly the kind of complex international situation that required swift, decisive action based on careful judgment and deep understanding of regional politics. Traditional protocol called for the king to consult with his council of advisors, review relevant treaties and agreements, and then issue a royal decree outlining Valdoria's response. But this situation occurred at precisely the moment when Alexander was trying to decide how much weight to give to traditional approaches versus new methods of governance. Should he follow established procedures, or should he implement some of Isabella's proposed reforms and seek broader input from affected parties? Isabella saw the crisis as an opportunity to demonstrate the value of her more inclusive approach. She proposed convening a special commission that would include not just noble advisors, but also representatives from the merchant class, military officers with direct knowledge of border conditions, and even some common citizens from the affected regions. The commission would gather information, hear different perspectives, and provide recommendations to the king, who would then make the final decision with the benefit of a more complete understanding of the situation. Serafina viewed Isabella's proposal with alarm. In her experience, complex international crises required swift, confidential decision-making based on established diplomatic relationships and careful consideration of long-term strategic implications. Involving multiple parties in the decision-making process would slow the response, potentially leak sensitive information to foreign powers, and create unrealistic expectations about public participation in matters of national security. She urged Alexander to follow traditional protocols and rely on the wisdom of experienced advisors who understood both the specific issues involved and the broader context of Valdorian foreign policy. The debate between these approaches consumed the royal court for days, with nobles, advisors, and officials taking sides based on their own interests and philosophies. Duke Rothschild, whose estates were directly threatened by the crisis, strongly supported Serafina's position and urged immediate military action to protect Valdorian interests. Lord Thornfield, whose merchant networks could be disrupted by prolonged uncertainty, favored Isabella's approach in hopes that broader consultation might lead to a more stable long-term solution. As the arguments raged in the palace, conditions on the northern border continued to deteriorate. Bretonnian forces had crossed into disputed territory, Valdorian merchants were fleeing the region, and local populations were growing increasingly anxious about the possibility of armed conflict. Each day that passed without a clear response from the crown made Alexander look more indecisive and undermined confidence in his ability to lead effectively. The turning point came when Alexander received a private letter from his father's longtime advisor, Lord Chancellor Blackwood, Seraphina's late husband's brother, who had served the crown faithfully for over 3 decades. The letter was respectful but direct, expressing concern about the paralysis that seemed to be affecting royal decision-making and urging swift action to resolve the northern crisis before it spiraled out of control. Your Majesty, the letter read in part, I understand the desire to consider all perspectives and to ensure that decisions are made thoughtfully and inclusively. These are admirable goals that reflect well on your character and your commitment to just governance. However, there are times when the responsibilities of leadership require decisive action based on the best available information, even when that information is incomplete or when the decision might be unpopular with some constituencies. The current crisis is one of those times. The letter went on to outline specific steps that Alexander could take to address the border situation while still leaving room for longer-term reforms in how such decisions were made. It was a masterful piece of advice that acknowledged the value of Isabella's concerns while providing a practical path forward that would prevent immediate damage to the kingdom's interests. But it was the letter's conclusion that had the greatest impact on Alexander's thinking. Your Majesty, your father faced many similar crises during his reign, and his approach was always to gather information quickly, consult with relevant experts, make the best decision possible under the circumstances, and then take full responsibility for the consequences. He understood that perfect decisions are rarely possible in governance, but that indecision is almost always worse than an imperfect choice made with good intentions and sound reasoning. That evening, Alexander summoned both Isabella and Seraphina to his private study for what would prove to be the most important conversation of his young reign. Outside, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall, and the light from the fireplace cast dancing shadows on the walls where portraits of previous kings watched silently over the scene. I've made my decision about how to handle the northern crisis, Alexander announced without preamble. And, more importantly, I've decided on the broader question of how we will approach governance going forward. Both women leaned forward slightly, recognizing that this moment would define not just the immediate crisis, but the entire character of Alexander's reign. The border situation requires immediate action, he continued. I will follow traditional protocols for this specific crisis, consult with relevant advisors, review existing treaties, and issue a royal decree within 48 hours. The kingdom cannot afford prolonged deliberation when Valdorian citizens are at risk and our international credibility is being questioned. Isabella's face showed disappointment, but she remained silent as Alexander continued. However, he said, looking directly at her, Isabella's concerns about the need for more inclusive governance are valid and important. Once this immediate crisis is resolved, I will establish a commission to review our decision-making processes and recommend reforms that can make our government more responsive to citizen needs without sacrificing the ability to act decisively when necessary. Now it was Seraphina's turn to look concerned, but Alexander wasn't finished. I want to be clear about something, he said, his voice carrying new authority. I am grateful for both of your counsel, and I will continue to seek advice from both of you. But I will not allow the crown to become a prize in a competition between competing visions of governance. I am the king, and the responsibility for decisions and their consequences rests with me alone. He stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the falling snow. Seraphina, your experience and wisdom are invaluable, and I need your continued counsel. But that counsel must come in the form of advice, not direction. I will not allow any advisor, no matter how respected, to make decisions for me or to undermine policies that I have chosen to pursue. Seraphina nodded slowly, recognizing both acknowledgement of her value and clear limits on her influence. Isabella, Alexander continued, turning to face his wife, your vision for a more just and inclusive Valdoria is one that I share, and we will work together to implement meaningful reforms. But those reforms must be practical, achievable, and carefully implemented. Revolution, even well-intentioned revolution, can destroy more than it creates. Isabella's expression showed relief, mixed with understanding that her more ambitious proposals would need to be modified and phased in gradually. Going forward, Alexander concluded, we will pursue a path that honors Valdoria's traditions while adapting to modern needs. We will preserve institutions that have served us well while reforming those that have become outdated or unjust. We will make decisions based on careful consideration of different perspectives, but we will make them decisively and take responsibility for their outcomes. In the weeks that followed, Alexander's approach proved to be politically astute and practically effective. The northern border crisis was resolved through traditional diplomatic channels, but the resolution included provisions for addressing underlying economic issues that had contributed to the dispute, a compromise that satisfied both traditional and reform-minded factions. The promised review commission was established with a membership that balanced experienced advisors with newer voices, and its eventual recommendations led to a series of gradual but meaningful reforms over the following years. Constitutional limits on royal power were introduced, but in a carefully structured way that preserved the crown's ability to act decisively during crises. Democratic representation was expanded, but through existing institutions rather than revolutionary new structures. Transparency requirements were implemented, but with appropriate protections for sensitive national security information. Most importantly, Alexander established himself as a king who would listen to competing viewpoints, but make his own decisions, who would respect tradition while embracing necessary change, and who would take responsibility for both the successes and failures of his reign. Serafina gradually transitioned into the role of elder stateswoman, providing counsel when requested, but no longer attempting to control policy direction. Her experience and relationships proved valuable in implementing reforms in ways that minimized disruption and maintained stability. Though she never fully embraced all of Isabella's ideas, she came to respect the younger woman's intelligence and commitment to justice. Isabella found ways to pursue her vision for social reform within the constraints of practical politics and traditional institutions. Her inclusive approach to governance proved popular with citizens and effective in addressing long-standing inequities, though the pace of change was slower than she had originally hoped. Over time, she developed a more nuanced understanding of the complexities involved in governing a traditional monarchy, while Alexander gained greater appreciation for the moral urgency behind her reform agenda. The kingdom prospered under their joint leadership, finding a balance between stability and progress that served as a model for other constitutional monarchies facing similar challenges. But perhaps most importantly, Alexander had learned the most crucial lesson of kingship, that true leadership requires the wisdom to listen, the courage to decide, and the strength to accept responsibility for the consequences of those decisions. As winter gave way to spring and then summer, the palace that had once echoed with whispered conspiracies and competing ambitions settled into a new rhythm of collaborative governance. The storm had passed, leaving behind a stronger foundation for the future and a royal family that had learned to transform conflict into cooperation. In the rose garden that Queen Lina had planted decades earlier, new blooms grew alongside the established plants, creating a garden more beautiful and diverse than any that had come before.